"If you want the baby, you lose the girl," his mother said, her voice as calm as if she were discussing the weather, not a human life. And in that quiet moment, something inside me finally understood that love in that house had always come with conditions. The words hung in the air of the marble kitchen like cold fog, drifting between the polished countertops and the tall windows that looked out over 12 acres of manicured lawn, a world so carefully perfect it almost looked unreal. I stood there holding the small bundle against my chest, the baby wrapped in a soft blue blanket that still smelled faintly of laundry soap and warm milk. And I remember thinking how strange it was that something so small could suddenly weigh more than everything else in my life combined. His name was Oliver Whitmore, heir to a family whose last name opened doors all over Boston, the grandson of a woman who believed that legacy mattered more than kindness. And me? I was just Maya Brooks, the girl who had been invisible in that mansion for nearly a year, the one who folded sheets, polished silver, and learned how to walk through hallways without making a sound. But babies have a way of changing the rules adults pretend are permanent. Oliver stirred slightly in my arms, his tiny fingers curling instinctively around the fabric of my sweater, and the movement felt like a question only I could answer. Across the room, Mrs. Whitmore watched me with the patient expression of someone used to winning. Her silver hair was pinned neatly behind her head, every strand exactly where it belonged, the kind of woman who believed discipline could shape the entire world if applied firmly enough. "This arrangement is simple," she continued, folding her hands together. "The child stays here. Our family raises him. You walk away, and we make sure you're comfortable." Comfortable. The word echoed in my mind, soft and hollow, like something meant to sound generous without actually being kind. Somewhere upstairs, a grandfather clock chimed the hour, the deep notes rolling slowly through the house. I had spent 11 months inside those walls learning how quiet wealth could be, how power rarely raised its voice. But in that moment, standing barefoot on a floor that cost more than the apartment building where I grew up, I realized something. Even more important. Some choices don't arrive loudly. They arrive quietly, in calm voices and polite smiles, dressed up like opportunities. Oliver shifted again, letting out a small sleepy sigh, and I looked down at his round face, the tiny crease between his eyebrows that always appeared when he dreamed. He didn't understand legacies or last names or the invisible lines rich families drew around their lives. He only understood warmth and the steady rhythm of a heartbeat close to his ear. I lifted my eyes back to Mrs. Whitmore, and for the first time since I had stepped into that mansion, I didn't feel small at all. Because in that moment I understood something she didn't. She thought she was giving me a choice. But the truth was, the decision had already been made the second Oliver's small hand closed around my sweater. And that was the day I took the baby and disappeared. The first rule of surviving inside the Whitmore estate was simple: do not exist more than necessary. I had learned that lesson during my first week there, when the head housekeeper, Mrs. Delgado, walked me through hallways lined with oil paintings and whispered instructions like they were sacred law. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not ask questions. And above all, never forget that the Whitmore family noticed everything even when they pretended not to see you. The mansion itself stood on the northern edge of Boston, a sprawling stone structure built nearly a century earlier, surrounded by tall maple trees and iron gates that opened only for certain cars. From the outside it looked like something from a magazine, all symmetry and wealth and quiet power. Inside, it ran like a machine. Every morning began at 5:30 when the kitchen lights came on and the smell of coffee filled the downstairs corridors. Staff moved through the house like shadows, polishing silver, vacuuming rugs imported from Turkey, arranging fresh flowers in rooms that rarely held visitors. For months my world had been limited to those routines, and I had been grateful for the simplicity. I needed the job more than I needed pride. My apartment in Dorchester cost $900 a month, and my mother's medical bills were still arriving in envelopes that felt heavier every time I opened them. That was how I ended up in the Whitmore household in the first place, answering an advertisement that promised steady pay and live-in options for reliable domestic staff. At the time, I did not know that the job would eventually place a newborn child in my arms and a decision on my conscience that would change everything. Oliver Whitmore arrived during the first snowfall of December, a tiny 6-pound baby with dark lashes and a quiet cry that sounded more like a question than a demand. The house changed overnight after that. Nurses came and went during the first weeks. Specialists brought equipment that hummed softly in the nursery. And Mrs. Whitmore began spending more time on the third floor where the baby's room overlooked the frozen garden. Yet despite the attention and the expensive bassinets and blankets, something always felt missing. Oliver rarely slept for long when he was alone, and the nurses eventually discovered something simple that none of the specialists could explain. He calmed down when someone held him close. That was how I first became part of his daily routine. It started with small moments during long afternoons when the house grew quiet and the winter light stretched across the hardwood floors. I would carry him gently across the nursery while humming songs my grandmother used to sing in church, slow melodies that moved like warm air through the room. Oliver would watch me with wide gray eyes, his tiny hand occasionally reaching toward my sleeve like he was making sure I had not disappeared. Over time, those quiet afternoons became the only moments when the massive house felt human. But houses like the Whitmore estate had rules that went far beyond schedules and chores. Bloodlines mattered. Appearances mattered. And the deeper I became part of Oliver's everyday life, the clearer it became that some people in that house believed affection should follow a very specific direction. They believed it should move downward from family to staff, never the other way around. By the time Oliver was 4 months old, everyone in the household could see the truth even if no one said it out loud. The baby reached for me before anyone else. The first time Mrs. Whitmore noticed it, the room went completely still. Oliver was lying in the wide ivory crib that stood near the tall nursery windows, sunlight spilling across the blankets like warm honey on a quiet spring afternoon, and 3 different adults were standing nearby trying to soothe him. One nurse adjusted the soft blanket around his legs. Another gently rocked the crib. Mrs. Whitmore herself stood with the quiet patience of someone who believed every problem in the world could be solved with enough discipline and enough control. But Oliver continued to fuss, his small face tightening with frustration, his tiny hands opening and closing as if he were searching for something that kept slipping away. I had been standing near the doorway holding a basket of freshly folded baby clothes, waiting for instructions the way I always did. The rule inside the Whitmore house was simple. Staff remained silent unless directly addressed. But Oliver suddenly turned his head toward the sound of my footsteps shifting on the polished wood floor. His crying paused for half a second, like a radio signal catching a familiar frequency. Then his gray eyes locked on me. The reaction was immediate. His arms lifted toward me with surprising determination for a child barely 4 months old. The movement was small, but it carried a kind of quiet certainty that filled the entire room. For a moment nobody moved. The nurse glanced toward Mrs. Whitmore. Mrs. Whitmore glanced toward me. The silence stretched long enough that even Oliver seemed to notice the hesitation around him. His small voice rose again, not angry, but restless, like he was trying to remind the room that babies do not understand social boundaries or family hierarchies. They only understand comfort. Finally, Mrs. Whitmore exhaled slowly, the kind of measured breath that suggested careful calculation. "Miss Brooks," she said, her tone smooth and controlled. "It appears he wants you." I stepped forward carefully, placing the basket of clothes on the nearby dresser before lifting Oliver from the crib with the practiced motion that had become second nature over the past few months. The moment his small body settled against my shoulder, the tension left him almost instantly. His breathing slowed. His tiny hand curled into the fabric of my sleeve like it had done 100 times before. The change in the room was subtle but impossible to ignore. The nurse stopped rocking the empty crib. Mrs. Whitmore's expression remained calm, but her sharp blue eyes studied the scene with the focus of someone analyzing an unexpected development. "Interesting," she murmured softly, almost to herself. That afternoon marked the beginning of something that no one inside that house had planned. Oliver began searching for me whenever he woke from his naps. His small eyes followed me across the nursery, even when other people held him. By the time spring arrived and the maple trees outside the windows turned bright green again, the pattern had become impossible to hide. The baby trusted me. And in a household where legacy and bloodline defined nearly every decision, that simple truth quietly unsettled the balance of the entire Whitmore estate. Spring arrived slowly across the Whitmore estate, the kind of quiet New England spring that crept in through open windows and warm sunlight rather than sudden heat. And with it, Oliver began to change in ways that no expensive pediatrician or visiting specialist could fully explain. He grew stronger every week, his small legs kicking against the soft blankets in the nursery, his curious eyes following every movement around the room, like he was studying the strange world he had arrived in only months earlier. But the most noticeable change was the way he responded to me. By then the entire household had seen it happen more times than anyone could count. When Oliver woke from his naps, his first reaction was always the same. His gray eyes searched the room slowly, carefully, as if he were checking a list of familiar faces. And when they found me, the rest of the room simply stopped existing. The nurses joked quietly about it during their breaks in the downstairs kitchen. Mrs. Delgado, who had worked in the Whitmore household for nearly 20 years, simply shook her head with the patient understanding of someone who had raised 3 children of her own before ever stepping inside the mansion. "Babies know," she told me one afternoon while slicing apples at the long marble counter. "They do not care about last names or family money. They know who makes them feel safe." Her words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Because the truth was, I had never planned for any of this. My life before the Whitmore estate had been small and ordinary. I had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Dorchester, the kind of place where neighbors recognized each other's voices through thin walls and summer evenings smelled like barbecue smoke drifting through open windows. My mother had worked double shifts at a hospital laundry room for nearly 20 years, saving every extra dollar she could manage so I would have the chance to attend community college. Nothing about my life had ever intersected with families like the Whitmores before. But Oliver did not know any of that. To him, I was simply the person who carried him through long afternoons when the nursery grew quiet and the sunlight stretched across the hardwood floors. I was the one who hummed soft songs while rocking him slowly near the tall windows that overlooked the garden. I was the voice that spoke gently when he woke up from dreams that left him confused and restless. Over time, those simple routines became something deeper than anyone inside the mansion seemed prepared to acknowledge. Oliver began reaching for me even when other people held him. His small hands stretched toward my sleeves whenever I passed the doorway of the nursery. Once, during a family visit on a Sunday afternoon, the moment became impossible to ignore. Several relatives had gathered in the sitting room, dressed in crisp spring clothing while discussing business deals and university plans. Oliver sat on Mrs. Whitmore's lap during the conversation, surrounded by polite laughter and expensive perfume. But when I stepped quietly into the room to refill the tea tray, the baby immediately leaned forward with both arms extended toward me. The room fell silent for a brief moment that seemed to last longer than it should have. Because for the first time, everyone present understood something that could not easily be explained away. The baby had already decided who he trusted most. That moment in the sitting room changed something inside the Whitmore house, even though no one said it out loud. Conversations resumed after a few seconds, teacups returned to delicate saucers, and the quiet rhythm of polite society continued as if nothing unusual had happened. But I noticed the way Mrs. Whitmore watched Oliver afterward. Her gaze lingered longer than before, sharp and thoughtful, the kind of look someone gives when a carefully arranged plan begins to shift in ways they did not expect. Oliver, however, seemed completely unaware of the tension that had quietly settled in the room. The second I lifted him from her lap, his tiny body relaxed against my shoulder with the peaceful confidence of a child who believes the world is exactly the way it should be. His small fingers curled around a loose strand of my hair, and he made a soft humming sound that always appeared when he was content. For him, the moment was simple. For everyone else, it was complicated. After that afternoon, subtle changes began appearing throughout the house. The nurses still followed their schedules, but I noticed that I was asked to spend more time upstairs in the nursery. Mrs. Delgado began assigning my cleaning duties to other staff members during the hours when Oliver was awake. No one explained the decision directly, yet the message was clear. The baby calmed more easily when I was nearby, and in a household that valued order above everything else, the easiest solution was simply to keep the peace. At first I told myself that the arrangement was temporary. Children grow. Babies outgrow the need to be held constantly. Soon Oliver would learn to crawl, then walk, then fill his days exploring the wide hallways and sunlit gardens beyond the nursery windows. Eventually, he would form stronger attachments to the family members whose last name he carried. That was the natural order of things. At least that was what I tried to believe. But every week that passed seemed to deepen the quiet bond that had formed between us. Oliver began recognizing the sound of my footsteps before I even entered the room. If he heard my voice from the hallway, his small head would turn instantly toward the door with bright anticipation. Sometimes when I carried him through the long corridor that connected the nursery to the library, he would rest his cheek against my shoulder and watch the sunlight drift across the polished floors like moving gold. Those moments felt strangely peaceful inside a house that often felt too large, too quiet, too carefully controlled. Yet beneath that calm routine, something else had begun to grow. I saw it most clearly in the way Mrs. Whitmore's expression changed whenever Oliver reached for me in front of guests. The smile remained on her face, but the warmth behind it faded slightly each time. Because in families like the Whitmores, affection was supposed to follow very clear lines. Children belonged to their bloodline. Loyalty belonged to the household. And love, if it appeared at all, was expected to move in the correct direction. No one said these rules directly, yet everyone inside that mansion understood them. Everyone except Oliver. And babies, as it turns out, have a quiet way of ignoring rules that adults spend entire lifetimes protecting. Summer arrived quietly across the Whitmore estate, bringing long golden evenings and the gentle hum of cicadas drifting through the tall maple trees that lined the property. And by then Oliver had reached the age where the world around him began to feel like a puzzle waiting to be explored. He could sit up without help now, his balance still uncertain but improving every day, his curious eyes studying every corner of the nursery like a tiny scientist determined to understand the rules of his new universe. The house itself seemed to move around him with its usual quiet discipline, staff walking carefully through hallways, gardeners trimming hedges that stretched nearly 200 feet along the southern lawn, drivers polishing Blacktown cars that waited patiently beside the circular driveway. But Oliver's attention rarely stayed on those details for long. Instead, he focused on people. More specifically, he focused on me. By then, the pattern had become impossible to hide from anyone who spent even a few minutes inside the nursery. If Oliver heard my voice somewhere down the hallway, his entire body would react before I even stepped through the doorway. His eyes would widen with recognition, and his small arms would lift toward the sound like he was greeting an old friend returning from a long journey. The nurses began laughing about it during their shifts, gently teasing me that the baby had already chosen his favorite person in the entire mansion. I tried to smile whenever they said it, but inside I always felt a quiet knot of uncertainty tighten in my chest. Because even though Oliver's trust felt natural and warm, I understood something he could not possibly know yet. The Whitmore estate was not the kind of place where emotional attachments formed freely without consequences. One afternoon in late June, that truth became clearer than ever. The family had invited several guests for a formal luncheon on the terrace overlooking the rose garden, the kind of event where crisp white tablecloths stretched across long dining tables and conversations revolved around investments, universities, and summer properties along the coast. I had been carrying Oliver through the hallway outside the terrace doors when we paused near the tall windows that faced the garden. Laughter floated in from outside along with the scent of freshly cut grass. Oliver watched the movement beyond the glass with bright curiosity, his tiny hand resting against the window as if he were touching the sunlight itself. Then the door behind us opened quietly. Mrs. Whitmore stepped into the hallway with the graceful composure she carried everywhere, her pale blue dress perfectly pressed, a silver bracelet catching the afternoon light as she adjusted it gently on her wrist. For a moment she simply observed us. Oliver noticed her almost immediately and turned his head toward her with the soft alert expression he often wore when someone new entered the room. She stepped closer and extended her arms with a polite smile. "Come here, Oliver," she said gently. I lowered him carefully into her arms. But the moment the transfer happened, the peaceful calm he had been enjoying disappeared. Oliver's small face tightened with confusion. His eyes searched the hallway quickly, moving from Mrs. Whitmore to me and back again. Then he reached toward me once more, both hands stretching forward with a quiet urgency that made the entire moment feel strangely fragile. For the first time since I had started working in that house, Mrs. Whitmore did not smile immediately. Instead, she studied Oliver's reaction in silence, her expression thoughtful and distant, like someone realizing that a simple situation had quietly grown into something far more complicated than anyone had originally intended. Mrs. Whitmore held Oliver carefully, supporting his small back with practiced elegance. But the baby continued leaning toward me with quiet determination, his tiny hands opening and closing in the air as if he believed that reaching far enough would somehow bring the distance between us back to zero. For a moment no one spoke. The hallway felt unusually silent despite the soft clinking of glasses and distant laughter drifting from the terrace, where guests continued enjoying their luncheon. Oliver's expression shifted from confusion to something softer, almost pleading, the kind of silent request only babies know how to make without words. I remained where I was, unsure whether stepping forward would help or make the situation worse. Inside a house like the Whitmore estate, every small movement carried meaning. Mrs. Whitmore studied Oliver's face carefully, her pale blue eyes thoughtful as she adjusted the baby slightly against her shoulder. "He is very attached to you," she said after a few seconds, her voice calm and composed. It was not an accusation. It sounded more like an observation spoken by someone examining a complicated equation. Oliver responded with a small restless sound, the quiet murmur babies make when the world does not match their expectations. His gaze moved between us again before finally settling on me once more. I stepped closer instinctively, speaking in the soft tone I always used with him. "It is all right, Oliver," I said gently. The moment he heard my voice clearly, his shoulders relaxed slightly, as if the sound itself had reassured him that everything was still in place. Mrs. Whitmore watched the interaction without interrupting. Then, with a careful motion that felt deliberate rather than emotional, she placed Oliver back into my arms. The change was immediate. His small body relaxed again, his breathing evening out as he rested his head against my shoulder. For several seconds, Mrs. Whitmore said nothing. The silence stretched between us, quiet but full of unspoken calculations. Finally, she folded her hands together with the same composed elegance she carried everywhere inside the estate. "Miss Brooks," she said slowly, "a household like this requires stability." I nodded politely even though I was not entirely certain what she meant. She continued watching Oliver, who now seemed perfectly content again, his small fingers curling gently around the fabric of my sleeve, as if he had already forgotten the brief moment of confusion. "Children form habits very quickly," she added, "especially in environments where they spend most of their time indoors." Her words sounded neutral, almost academic, yet something beneath the calm tone suggested that the situation had already begun shifting in her mind from coincidence to problem. Outside the tall windows, sunlight stretched across the gardens where guests continued their conversations, and waiters carried silver trays between the tables. Life at the Whitmore estate continued smoothly, exactly the way it always had. Yet standing there in that quiet hallway, I felt a strange sense that something subtle had changed forever. Oliver had made his choice without understanding the rules of the world he had been born into. And in a house built on tradition, lineage, and carefully maintained appearances, even the smallest unexpected choice could quietly disturb the balance everyone else worked so hard to preserve. The rest of that afternoon passed with the quiet rhythm the Whitmore estate had perfected over generations. Yet something invisible had shifted in the air, something subtle that only people who lived inside that house long enough could recognize. Oliver remained calm in my arms as we returned to the nursery, the warm June sunlight spilling across the polished floors and pale walls like a soft golden blanket. Outside the tall windows, the gardens stretched wide and peaceful, rows of roses swaying gently in the afternoon breeze, the same carefully maintained landscape that had greeted visitors for nearly 80 years. But inside the nursery, Oliver's world remained much smaller. His attention followed the sound of my voice as I spoke softly while settling him into the rocking chair near the window. His small hands rested against my sweater, as if holding on to something steady in a world he was only beginning to understand. For him, the day had simply been another small adventure. For the adults inside the house, it had quietly confirmed something no one had expected when Oliver first arrived that winter. Later that evening, the household returned to its normal routine. Guests departed through the long front drive, where black cars waited beneath the tall iron gates. Waiters cleared the terrace tables while the sky slowly turned the deep blue color that often appears during warm New England summers. I carried Oliver through the quiet halls as the evening lights came on one by one, each lamp casting a soft glow against the antique wood paneling that lined the corridors. The house always felt larger at night, as if the silence stretched across every floor like an ocean. Oliver watched the shifting lights with bright curiosity, his gray eyes reflecting the warm glow of the lamps as we passed beneath them, invisible lines that wealthy families spend generations protecting. They only respond to comfort, warmth, and the familiar rhythm of someone who has spent hours holding them close. That night, after Oliver finally fell asleep in the nursery crib, I stood near the window watching the lights of Boston glowing faintly in the distance nearly 10 miles away. The city looked peaceful from that height, a soft collection of lights resting quietly beneath the dark sky. For a moment, everything felt still. Then a quiet knock sounded against the nursery door. I turned and saw Mrs. Whitmore standing in the hallway, her posture as composed as ever, her silver bracelet catching the soft lamplight. She stepped inside slowly, her gaze moving toward the crib where Oliver slept peacefully beneath the pale blue blanket. For several seconds, she simply observed him in silence. Then she looked at me. "Miss Brooks," she said calmly, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used during business conversations with guests. "We need to discuss Oliver's routine going forward." In that moment, I understood something that had not yet been spoken aloud inside the Whitmore estate. What had once been a simple arrangement of convenience had quietly become a question of control. And in families built on legacy, control was never something they allowed to drift for long. Mrs. Whitmore closed the nursery door softly behind her, the quiet click echoing through the room like the closing of a conversation that had not yet begun. The warm lamplight cast long shadows across the pale walls, and Oliver slept peacefully in his crib, unaware that the adults standing a few feet away were about to discuss the direction of his entire routine. Mrs. Whitmore stepped closer to the crib first, her gaze resting on the baby with the composed expression she carried everywhere inside the estate. For several seconds, she said nothing, simply watching the slow rise and fall of his tiny chest beneath the pale blue blanket. Then she turned her attention toward me. "Oliver is becoming more aware of his surroundings," she said calmly, her voice low enough not to disturb his sleep. "At this stage, consistency is very important." I nodded politely, waiting for her to continue. Working inside the Whitmore house had taught me that conversations with Mrs. Whitmore often unfolded slowly, like careful negotiations rather than ordinary discussions. She folded her hands together lightly in front of her. "Children in families like ours are expected to grow into certain environments," she continued. "They must learn early where they belong." The sentence lingered in the quiet room longer than the words themselves. I felt the meaning behind it, even though she had not said anything directly about me. Oliver shifted slightly in his sleep, letting out a soft sigh before settling again, completely unaware that the adults beside his crib were discussing his place in a world he had only recently entered. Mrs. Whitmore walked slowly toward the tall window where the city lights shimmered faintly in the distance. "Your presence has been helpful during his early months," she said after a moment, still facing the glass. "However, emotional habits formed too strongly can become difficult to adjust later." Her tone remained calm and measured, yet the message beneath it was unmistakable. She turned back toward me. "Beginning next week, Oliver will spend more time with the nursing staff. We will gradually reduce the hours you spend directly caring for him." The words landed quietly but firmly in the room. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. I looked toward the crib where Oliver slept peacefully, his small hand resting near his cheek like a child completely secure in his world. Mrs. Whitmore followed my gaze and her expression softened just slightly, though not with warmth. It was more like the expression of someone managing a complicated situation that required careful correction. "This is not a criticism of your work, Miss Brooks," she added. "You have performed your duties very well." She paused before finishing the thought. "But Oliver must learn the structure of this household." The meaning was clear. Stability, in the Whitmore estate, meant that certain bonds could not grow too strong in the wrong direction. I nodded slowly, understanding that arguing would change nothing. Mrs. Whitmore studied my reaction briefly before turning toward the door once again. Before leaving, she looked back at the crib where Oliver continued sleeping peacefully. "Children adapt faster than adults believe," she said quietly. Then she stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind her. The nursery fell silent again, the soft glow of the lamp casting warm light across the crib where Oliver slept. Yet standing there beside him, listening to the quiet rhythm of his breathing, I could not shake the feeling that the simple world he trusted so easily was about to change in ways he could not possibly understand. The next morning arrived with the same quiet discipline that governed every day inside the Whitmore estate, yet the nursery felt different in a way that was difficult to explain. The early sunlight slipped through the tall windows and stretched across the pale carpet in long golden lines, while the distant sound of gardeners beginning their work drifted softly through the open glass. Oliver woke just after 6, the same time he usually stirred each morning, his small hands moving against the blanket as his gray eyes slowly opened to study the familiar room around him. For a few peaceful seconds, he simply watched the light shifting across the ceiling. Then he began searching. It was a small movement, barely noticeable to anyone who did not know him well. His gaze moved slowly from the crib railing to the rocking chair beside the window, then toward the nursery door, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. But the routine had already changed. One of the nurses entered first, offering him a gentle smile while lifting him carefully from the crib. Oliver blinked with quiet curiosity, studying her face with the thoughtful attention babies often give to new experiences. The nurse spoke softly as she carried him across the room toward the changing table, explaining the morning routine in the calm professional tone that nurses use when caring for infants. Oliver listened, his eyes wide and observant. Yet something in his expression suggested he was still waiting for the peace of the morning that had not arrived. Downstairs the house followed its usual schedule. Coffee brewed in the kitchen, silver trays were arranged for breakfast, and the long dining room filled with the faint clinking of porcelain plates being set on the polished table. I remained in the lower hallway completing the tasks Mrs. Delgado had assigned earlier that morning, yet my thoughts drifted repeatedly toward the nursery upstairs. The new arrangement had begun exactly the way Mrs. Whitmore had described it. Gradually, quietly, without confrontation or explanation to the one person most affected by the change. Around mid-morning, I carried a stack of freshly pressed linens up the main staircase toward the 3rd floor, the same route I had taken nearly every day for months. The hallway outside. The nursery felt unusually still. When I reached the doorway, I heard a soft, restless sound coming from inside. Oliver sat in the nurse's arms near the window, his small body twisting slightly as his eyes searched the room once again. The nurse tried gently rocking him while humming a quiet melody, but the motion did not seem to settle him the way it usually did. Oliver's gaze drifted toward the open doorway where I stood for a brief moment with the folded linens in my arms. The second he saw me, his entire expression changed. His eyes brightened instantly, and both hands lifted toward me with the same quiet certainty he had shown so many times before. The reaction was immediate and impossible to ignore. Oliver leaned forward with hopeful anticipation, the soft sound he made carrying clearly through the quiet room. The nurse glanced toward me with a sympathetic expression that suggested she understood the situation perfectly well. For a moment no one moved. Neatly arranged toys on the floor, yet the peaceful setting no longer matched the tension slowly building in the air. Oliver made another soft sound, more insistent this time, the kind that usually meant he was trying to explain something in the only language he knew. The nurse glanced toward the hallway behind me, as if checking whether anyone else might appear. When no one did, she spoke quietly. "You can come closer if you want," she said in a gentle voice that carried both kindness and understanding. I stepped into the nursery slowly, placing the stack of linens on the dresser near the changing table before approaching them. Oliver reacted instantly. His entire body leaned forward again, his small hands stretching toward my sleeve with unmistakable certainty. The nurse smiled faintly, though the expression held a trace of concern as well. "He really does recognize you," she murmured. For a brief moment the choice felt simple. I could take Oliver into my arms, and the familiar calm would return, just like it always had before. But the quiet memory of Mrs. Whitmore's words lingered firmly in my mind. Children must learn the structure of this household. I hesitated, my hand hovering in the air for a second before slowly lowering again. Oliver noticed the hesitation immediately. Babies are remarkably sensitive to changes in routine, even when those changes appear invisible to everyone else. His expression shifted from hopeful anticipation to confusion. The nurse gently bounced him against her shoulder, whispering soft reassurances while walking slowly across the room. Oliver continued watching me as if waiting for the missing part of the moment to finally arrive. Eventually his small voice softened into a tired whimper, the sound of someone beginning to accept a world that suddenly felt unfamiliar. I stepped back toward the doorway quietly, forcing myself to leave the room the way the new routine required. But as I walked down the hallway, I could still hear the faint restless sounds drifting from the nursery behind me. And for the first time since Oliver had entered the Whitmore estate, the carefully controlled order of that house no longer felt entirely certain. The days that followed unfolded slowly, yet inside the Whitmore estate the smallest changes began revealing themselves in ways that no one could completely ignore. The new routine continued exactly as Mrs. Whitmore had planned. Oliver spent more hours with the nurses, and my work returned to the quiet domestic rhythm that had filled my life before the nursery had ever become part of my day. Each morning began downstairs among polished counters and neatly arranged trays, the scent of coffee drifting through the kitchen while the rest of the mansion woke gradually beneath the soft light of early summer. Yet even within that carefully organized structure, Oliver's awareness seemed to grow sharper with every passing day. Babies notice patterns long before adults believe they do. By the end of the week, the nurses had already begun whispering about it quietly during their breaks. Oliver had become more restless during certain parts of the day, especially in the late mornings when he used to spend hours sitting near the tall nursery window while I hummed softly beside him. Now the rocking chair remained empty most mornings, its wooden frame catching the sunlight without the gentle rhythm it once held. One afternoon, Mrs. Delgado found me folding freshly dried linens near the laundry room, and paused for a moment with the thoughtful expression of someone who had watched families long enough to understand how fragile their routines could become. "He is searching for you," she said quietly, not as criticism, but as a simple observation. I did not answer right away. The words did not feel surprising, yet hearing them spoken aloud made the reality harder to ignore. Upstairs, the nursery continued operating with its usual precision. The nurses followed their schedules carefully, feeding Oliver at the exact hours listed on the chart pinned near the door, placing him down for naps according to the carefully measured routine that had been prepared for him. Yet Oliver's reactions were beginning to shift in small ways that even the charts could not explain. Sometimes he would pause during playtime and stare toward the doorway with quiet concentration, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. Other times his attention would drift toward the hallway whenever footsteps echoed faintly through the upper floor. One late afternoon, the pattern finally became impossible to ignore. Mrs. Whitmore herself stepped into the nursery, while one of the nurses attempted to settle Oliver after a restless nap. The baby sat upright in the crib, his small hands gripping the railing while his gray eyes scanned the room with patient determination. The nurse tried offering him a brightly colored toy, but Oliver barely glanced at it. Instead, he turned toward the doorway again, waiting. Mrs. Whitmore stood silently near the window watching the scene unfold. The soft sunlight framed Oliver's small figure in the crib, while the quiet hum of the estate drifted faintly through the walls. After a moment, she spoke softly to the nurse. "How long has he been doing that?" The nurse hesitated before answering honestly. "Since the routine changed, ma'am." Mrs. Whitmore did not respond immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on Oliver as he continued watching the empty doorway with calm, patient expectation. For the first time since she had decided to correct the household routine, a quiet realization began forming behind her composed expression. Because Oliver was not resisting the structure of the house. He was simply waiting for the person he believed belonged in it. The quiet waiting in the nursery continued for several more minutes while the soft afternoon light drifted slowly across the floor, and Mrs. Whitmore remained standing near the window, watching Oliver with the careful attention of someone reconsidering a decision that had seemed perfectly logical only days earlier. The baby continued gripping the crib railing with his small fingers, his gray eyes still fixed on the doorway, as if the simple act of patience might eventually bring the missing piece of his world back into place. The nurse tried gently rocking the crib again, speaking softly in a reassuring voice, but Oliver barely reacted. He was not crying or protesting anymore. Instead, he watched the doorway with a calm focus that felt almost older than his small age. Mrs. Whitmore noticed that detail immediately. Children often express frustration loudly, yet Oliver had chosen something quieter. He was waiting. The realization settled slowly across her composed expression. For a moment she said nothing. Then she turned slightly toward the nurse. "Where is Miss Brooks right now?" she asked in a calm voice that carried no visible emotion. The nurse hesitated briefly before answering. "She is downstairs, ma'am, in the laundry corridor." Mrs. Whitmore looked back at Oliver once more. The baby had not moved from his small post at the railing. His patient gaze still aimed toward the doorway, as though he believed the answer to his confusion would eventually appear there. The room remained silent except for the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere beyond the gardens. Finally, Mrs. Whitmore made a small decision that seemed almost invisible from the outside. "Please ask her to come up," she said quietly. A few minutes later, footsteps echoed along the hallway outside the nursery. When I stepped through the doorway, Oliver reacted instantly. The calm patience on his face dissolved into bright recognition, and both of his hands lifted toward me with excited certainty. The nurse glanced toward Mrs. Whitmore before carefully lifting Oliver from the crib and placing him gently into my arms. The moment he settled against my shoulder, the familiar calm returned as naturally as breathing. Oliver's small fingers curled into the fabric of my sleeve, and he rested his head against me with complete trust, the quiet rhythm of his breathing slowing once again. Mrs. Whitmore watched the scene without speaking. For a long moment, she studied Oliver's peaceful expression and the simple ease that had returned to the room. Then she folded her hands lightly in front of her and exhaled a quiet breath. "It seems," she said slowly, "that stability sometimes appears in unexpected places." The nurse lowered her eyes politely, while I remained standing beside the crib with Oliver resting comfortably against my shoulder. Mrs. Whitmore walked closer and looked down at the baby once more. This time her expression softened in a way that had not appeared before. "Perhaps," she added thoughtfully, "the structure of a household must sometimes learn from the child living inside it." She turned toward the window where the late afternoon sunlight shimmered across the gardens outside the estate. The same carefully maintained world that had once seemed so perfectly ordered. But inside the nursery the balance had quietly shifted in a way that even tradition could not easily rewrite. Because Oliver had never learned the rules that adults tried to enforce around him. He had only followed the one instinct children trust above everything else. And in the end, even the Whitmore estate had to listen to the quiet truth he carried in his small hands.